interwebs, and welcome to my review of Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 3, Episode 3, titled Shuttle to Kenfori, which just might actually be the most literal title in all of Star Trek history. I mean, there is, in fact, a shuttle, and it does go to Kenfori. I miss the days when they would just give us titles like, For the World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky, or The Butcher's Knife Cares Not for the Lamb's Cry. What is Star Trek coming to? Though Lower Decks did give us an episode literally titled Caves that was about caves. But still, shut up. Okay, so as many of you know, I usually try to give my spoiler-free thoughts before diving right into an episode, but that's going to be kind of tough on this one for a few reasons. First, there's a big reveal in this episode, at least setting-wise, that I don't want to ruin for you, because it's a genuinely fun moment and absolutely will be the thing that people will remember when they talk about this episode in the future. Like, I for sure know that this episode is going to be known as the blank episode of Strange New Worlds. So, kind of hard to talk about it when the very premise of the episode is a spoiler. But beyond that, I also kind of have mixed feelings on this one, because as I was watching, I kept asking, what is this episode actually about? Because in many ways, it's trying to do a lot of different things. And to be fair to it, some of it does actually work. There are moments here that I genuinely liked. But it never quite becomes more than the sum of its parts. And a lot of those parts also get kind of lost in the shuffle of it all. Even the episode's central pitch and conceit that I've already alluded to. And as a result, the episode feels kind of scattered and unfocused. I mean, what it does do is advance several ongoing plot threads in the show, some of which even stretch back to last season, but it never really presents a cohesive narrative on its own terms. It just so happens to have this big, obvious gimmick baked into it, which gives the episode an illusion of a focused premise, but in reality, it feels like it's more just a moving pieces setup episode of a serialized show. You know those episodes that you get often towards the end of seasons or beginning of seasons where you can clearly tell that the writers of the show are trying to move characters around and get them in a specific place for stuff they want to do later on in the season? That's what this episode kind of feels like, which is kind of weird for Strange New Worlds because the whole pitch of this series is that it's supposed to be a return to traditional episodic Star Trek storytelling structure with a small smattering of serialized storytelling. That's been what they've been doing for the past 2 seasons. And so this episode just kind of feels out of place as a result. And since I can't say much more about it without diving into spoilers, all I will say is that your enjoyment of this episode will really depend on how invested you are in the ongoing plot lines this season. And for me personally, if you saw my review of the season premiere, I'm not really gung-ho about some of the ongoing plots this season. There are things, again, that I liked here, but a lot of it just does not land for me. Which is, again, about all I can say without going into spoilers. So, jump out if you don't want to be spoiled. Alright, so now that we're in spoilers, like I said, there's a lot going on this episode, and that's even before we get to the Last of Us of it all. Thankfully, though, we're not beating Spock up with a golf club in this episode, but we'll get to that part of it. But I want to start with the storyline that starts it all off, and actually was the one that had me most worried, because it was actually the one that I ended up liking the most by the end of the episode. Specifically because of the final scene of that storyline, and that is the Battel and Pike plot here. As many of you may remember, I mentioned in my review of the first 2 episodes of this season that I was really concerned they were going to sideline Battel or make her give up her captaincy so she could be near Pike, which frankly I would have absolutely hated as a storyline. I do not like writing a woman giving up her career for her boyfriends. Absolutely no thanks. So I was actually really, really relieved when we started off this episode learning immediately that Battel was about to leave to go take a new command, even if we didn't actually learn where that command was. But then, almost immediately after that, we saw her passed out on the floor, and I began to worry all over again because I thought, oh great, now they're going to say that she's too sick to take the job. But maybe I'm just being a bit too overly cautious with this show, given its treatment of women elsewhere on it. Because thankfully, at least this week, her medical situation is actually instead used to launch us on a more familiar but solid plot structure, which is we need to find a rare cure in a dangerous place that we're not allowed to go. That's a classic setup. We've seen it a billion times, but it's one that works pretty well. But what almost lost me on this, though, was how much the story then began to center on Pike's emotions. Especially early on, I was really frustrated by how much screen time was spent on Pike's emotional response, maybe is the better way to put it, to be the hero and save his girlfriend. I get it that Pike's the main character of the show in a large extent, but my initial reaction was I just wish the show had a better way to centralize and focus on how Battel was feeling about everything and actually allowed her to be active in the situation rather than Pike being the gung-ho hero that has to go and save his, partner. And it also kind of bothered me up top that he was being told a ton of private medical information in that first scene, and we never actually see Battel give permission for that, and it felt like a weird overstep. I say all of that to say that the show actually got me back because once you get to the end of the episode and I see the full context of what this episode was actually doing, I really, really like how that opening medical scene plays on a rewatch because you can tell that Spock, Chapel, and Mbenga are actually carefully protecting Battel's privacy in that scene. They're only telling Pike what he needs to know as the captain, not even as the boyfriend, so that he can authorize a mission into disputed Klingon territory. And that's all they give him, nothing else. And so I really appreciated the kind of bait and switch there in a deliberate attempt to protect Battel's confidentiality. If only McCoy had done that with Spock's brain.
Come on, Bones, what's the mystery? His brain is gone.
And I really, really love that once we arrive on the planet and Pike and Mbenga went on their unofficial mission, Mbenga continues to reassure Pike as a friend about Battel without ever compromising Battel's medical privacy. It shows how good of a person he is and how good of a doctor he is, especially in light of the scene on the shuttle where we're reminded on how long Pike and Mbenga have been friends, something we really haven't acknowledged all that much since the pilot episode of Strange New Worlds.
Please dispense some wisdom.
Okay. Never get the house dressing.
Good to see you.
Like, we can actually see how difficult it is for Mbenga to navigate the ethical waters of understanding that Pike is his captain, his friend, but also protecting Battel's privacy from her boyfriend. It's a very complicated mire of ethics that I actually think the show kind of showcases pretty well. That said, though, again, it does bug me that Pike, who, while understandably upset and worried for Battel, does spend most of the episode trying to pry information out of Mbenga. He is Mbenga's commanding officer, and while Mbenga holds his ground, it's a really kind of inappropriate dynamic for Pike himself to be pushing. It kind of makes me like Mbenga a lot more and Pike a little bit less. And then when Pike, just given the situation that they're in, actually does find out Battel accepted a treatment that involves splicing her genes with Gorn DNA, he gets angry, and I get angry at him. Because again, Pike, it's not your fucking choice. It's her body, her choice. Get the fuck over it, man. So I was, again, kind of really reticent on where the storyline was going with Pike. But what ultimately saves this whole storyline for me is that the episode knows that this is a problem with Pike's reaction and actually lets Battel call him out directly in their final scene. She tells him exactly what needed to be said. It's not your business. I made this decision for myself, and while you are my boyfriend, I didn't tell you because I wanted to make the choice for me, and I also knew that you'd try to talk me out of it. It probably doesn't speak well to their long-term health of their relationship overall that she knows Pike wouldn't have immediately respected her choice. And again, this episode kind of makes me not like Pike more than I used to, but I do really appreciate that the episode itself actually acknowledges the issues with Pike's response. So while I don't love how much time we spent focused on Pike's emotional response over Battel's, I do love that the story pushes back on the problems with Pike's perspective and ends with Battel being clear in the type of support that she wants from him.
Because of this, because I don't have the space to worry about how my dying hurts your feelings.
That final scene really makes this whole episode for me and actually is my favorite scene of the entire episode. Moving on, though, I do find it interesting that the Gorn seem to be infecting, for lack of a better word, multiple people now at this point in the season. We have Battel, We see in the other storyline this episode that it's also starting to affect Ortagus in some way, and now even Spock might be affected too because of his mind meld with Battel, or at least aware of how Battel's mind is being shaped by the Gorn in some way. Again, I will say I'm not the biggest fan of how the Gorn storyline has been shaping up so far, but I am curious to see where they're going with this. My one worry with this storyline, I'm not saying this is what they're actually doing, and so this is just me speculating, but I really hope they don't go down this route. My one worry would be, it feels like they might be setting up Battel slowly becoming more and more Gorn-like because of this treatment, and then maybe in the season finale she'll fully transform or join the Gorn in some way, and the crew will need to go and save her or something. And then I wonder if the end revelation of the season will then be that she actually joins the Gorn permanently, or what she does actually transforms the Gorn as a species in some way from being, as Pike put it at the end of last season, being just monsters into being more intelligent, or the humanized kind of Gorn that we see in future Star Trek series. And I would really hate that if that's the direction they go in, because it would be that they are just monsters until one of us humans makes them more like us. That kind of anthropomorphizing, that a species only becomes worthy of respect or seen as people once they more closely resemble humans, is exactly the kind of ethnocentric, I guess would maybe be the best word, human-centric, some underscoring like colonial logic in their ideology that Star Trek, at least overtly, is supposed to challenge. That storyline would have a sort of we civilize the primitives through eugenics vibe to it, and if you go back to episodes like The Devil in the Dark from the original series, that is an episode that says something completely alien, even terrifying at first, like the Horta, can still be intelligent and worthy of our compassion, empathy, and respect as its own being, on its own terms. That's what infinite diversity and infinite combinations is all about, after all. So I really hope that they're not going in that direction. But again, to be fair, this is me just speculating. They can go in an entire other way, like maybe Battel getting Gorn DNA helps her understand the Gorn on their own terms. And I would like that a hell of a lot more, even if I wouldn't like the, genetics-y, gene splicey angle of it. But it would at least be like, oh, we understand the Gorn from their own perspective, instead of them coming to be more like us. So we'll see where it ends up going. That's just I'm just going to put a pin in that as a potential concern I have with where the storyline could go. But again, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But all this brings me to the thing that I actually haven't talked much about, despite it being kind of the central conceit of the episode overall, is the zombies. Very much this episode does feel like the writers kind of threw darts at a board and landed on a let's do a Last of Us kind of episode. And you know what? That's fine. Star Trek has done genre riffs before. We had Genesis on TNG, which was a great creature feature. Voyager had The Haunting on Deck 12, which was a kind of sci-fi ghost story. Enterprise itself even gave us Vulcan zombies in the season 3 episode Impulse. And we also had whatever Sub Rosa was. Gothic space ghost grandma erotica?
You're not Nana. Nana's dead. Leave her alone!
But the problem here in this episode, though, for me, is that the zombies kind of just become background noise to everything else going on. Because between Pike and Battel's drama, the stuff with Ortagus that we'll get to in a minute, as well as Mbenga's arc that we'll also get to in just a second, the zombies never really take center stage. They're just a gimmick that kind of pops up occasionally in the background to add tension to a scene. They were genuinely surprising when they showed up. Like, I really loved the build-up. Mbenga noting that there was no life on the planet at all kind of gave me chills. And when the zombies actually do appear mid-Klingon firefight, I actually went, holy shit! And I also think the makeup is beautiful. The makeup people on this episode did a great job making them look truly scary Klingon and human zombies. And I would have loved a full-on episode centered around just that idea. But instead, they feel like a wasted opportunity. Well executed, but ultimately underused in service of the larger ongoing plots this episode. Which does bring me, by the way, if we're talking about ongoing plots, back to Ortagus' storyline on the Enterprise, as it ties into the larger Gorn possession stuff that she seems to be going through here. On the surface, I do really love that Ortagus is finally seeming to be getting a season-long arc this year. And this episode does actually even set up something genuinely compelling for her. Ortagus is showing signs of PTSD from everything that happened with the Gorn in the season premiere. ultimately leading to her pushing back against her commander, being insubordinate in some ways, and even disobeying orders when she disagrees. And I actually really like the tension that brings between her and Una throughout the episode, and especially in that last scene where Una confronts Ortagus. You can really tell that Una is trying to have a balance between being a strong leader, but also compassionate and a friend. And I think that could have been a really interesting way to explore trauma and PTSD and how it has long-term effects on people beyond the immediate, and how someone who's gone through trauma can find their relationships reshaping because they now have reactions or triggers to things that they didn't have before, and it kind of shifts how they interact with people. And I actually really, really like that as a storyline for Ortagus. But ultimately, my problem kind of is with it is that what we're seeing is not actually Ortagus. It's Gorn mind control or possession or manipulation somehow in a way that we don't fully understand yet. And look, I don't mind a mind control or possession plot. I actually enjoy them when they're contained to like a single episode. Like you get Lore taking over Data for a few minutes to capture the Enterprise, or Keiko getting possessed by the Pa Wraiths and making O'Brien suffer yet again. Like those episodes can be fun. However, when it spans multiple episodes, it does risk feeling like a CW drama where we get forced interpersonal conflict that doesn't grow out of real character dynamics, just something done just to make conflict happen for no real reason. I've seen enough Arrowverse shows to know exactly how this could play out. And what's frustrating is that while I'm glad Melissa Navia gets more to do, we're not potentially really learning anything real about Ortagus as a character. She's already been underused, and now the show's giving her more screen time, but without potential character depth. We're watching just how she behaves under the influence of the Gorn, not who she actually is. So when we have these conversations like between La'an and Una where they're talking about like, hey, how maybe the trauma of the Gorn has changed Ortagus in some ways, the implication of that scene for us as the audience is that no, they're wrong, there's something else that these two are missing. Where I would actually much rather, and find it much more interesting personally, just in terms of getting to know these characters, and especially Ortagus more, if we got rid of the Gorn stuff entirely and it actually was her reacting out of trauma and PTSD. That would kind of be more interesting to me, frankly. Mind control storylines can work long-term when they do strain deep established relationships. Hell, this is going to be a weird example, so stick with me for a second, but Teen Wolf. Yes, Teen Wolf, my beloved trashy soap opera show, nailed actually this with its arc in season 3, which was the only time that show was unironically great. Like, I do ironically love that show. It's again, great trash soap opera, but season 3 was actually legitimately really, really good because it did have a possession plot in it, and I don't want to spoil it too much, but Stiles' possession in that season landed because it was less about Stiles' trauma and PTSD pushing him away from other characters, and more about how his perceived PTSD pushed other characters away from him. And that worked because we had spent seasons building up a really textured and layered and complex and emotional bonds with Stiles, Dylan O'Brien's character, with the other characters in the show. And that could be what they could do here in Strange New Worlds, but the problem is Ortagus doesn't really have these kind of nuanced relationships in this show so far. Most of what we've seen from her on the show are her professional dynamics. Her being on the bridge and making quips with Pike. And we've very rarely gotten to see really deep personal relationships between her and the other characters. And her few episodes that she's gotten the spotlight, like the one in season 2, have been about her memory being wiped and her just reasserting that she's the pilot of the Enterprise. Again, showing her role, but not showing who she is beyond the job. So when this emotional betrayal or PTSD storyline hits, it lands more in generic, I care about you as a friend, get it together territory between her and characters like Una. And those scenes work, but more because the actors are really, really strong in conveying nuance and depth in it, but not because the writing, both before this episode and in this episode, give us anything really rich and layered to work within here. But again, I guess we'll have to see where all of this goes in the weeks to come, because it may end up working out well, but I think My big concern with this is I find this interesting, but the mind control possession-y part of it doesn't really land as well for me, for all of the reasons I discussed. Also, side note here, what was up with Una's hair this episode? I know hair can be a deeply personal thing. It can be, especially for actors, it can be tied to identity, culture, community, and authenticity. And maybe choosing this style is a really important choice for actress Rebecca Romijn for herself, which, if so, that would be really, really great. What I will say, though, is the sudden drastic change to a very radically different hairstyle this episode did distract me a little bit. It honestly gave me flashbacks to Star Trek Voyager's early seasons, where producers kept messing with Janeway's hair every other week, because, God forbid, men don't give constant comments on a woman's hair. But again, if this was Rebecca Romijn's choice, and there is, a deeper meaning to her hairstyle, I think that's really, really cool, and I would love to hear it. I'm always here for bold new locks. So I don't hate it. It was just a little jarring, I guess is the best way to put it. It was just such a drastic change that it feels worth mentioning at the very least. Also, an aside here, it is interesting that this episode has Una commanding the Enterprise against a Klingon cruiser while Pike is indisposed, because that's actually very similar to a plot line from author James Swallow's recent Star Trek Strange New Worlds tie-in book, Towards the Night. It's just kind of interesting that, these two very similar plot lines were released very close to one another. Most people who watch Strange New Worlds don't read the book, so they won't clock it, but it was just an interesting comparison for me. But this all brings me to the final storyline of the episode, which is M'Benga's confrontation with the daughter of Ra, the Klingon ambassador that he killed in last season's Under the Cloak of War. Ra's daughter here is an interesting character, because she's not actually out for revenge in the typical Klingon sense. I initially thought she was there, as the characters did, to avenge her father's death, and kill the guy who killed her father because he killed someone from her house, as we've kind of seen many Klingons do before in many other episodes and series. But instead, she wants to kill M'Benga, not because he killed her father necessarily, but because he killed him before she had the chance to be the one to kill him and restore her house's honor. I really like that little nuance there. I also really like that she wanted to kill her own father because, as she says, he was a war criminal and betrayed his honor, which is what M'Benga killed him for as well. So they actually both kind of agree on that point. As well as, to her mind, she also believes that he betrayed Klingon values by reaching out to the Federation and trying to make peace, which is something I would believe that M'Benga would disagree on. But, there's an interesting overlap between the reasons that both of these characters disliked Ra. It's a really kind of compelling wrinkle in the Klingon code of honor here. It adds a layer of nuance that we don't always get with Klingon storylines. My big problem, though, is that this episode doesn't give any of this storyline enough time to develop. With everything else here, it feels rushed, and it's all squeezed into just a couple of scenes this episode, mostly them being expository ones shot on the volume and with zombies jumping into a force field around them. That said, though, there is some good nuance here in the performances. There's a really great line that M'Benga gives where he says, "I killed too many Klingons to know which house you're from."
I have killed too many Klingons to know which house you're from.
Which is an absolutely baller line, but I really love that Babs, the actor who plays M'Benga, delivers that line not with bravado or aggression, but calmly, and even kind of almost apologetically. It really actually says a lot about M'Benga. That's a lot of nuance in a line that could very easily just kind of come off as one note, "I've killed too many Klingons to know which house you're from." The actors in the show are fucking great. All that praise said, though, I am also really unsure of how I feel about this episode returning to the plot line from Under the Cloak of War. If you watch my reviews of last season, or even my season-long video essay on it, I didn't really love that episode's ending. Not because I think ambiguity is bad. I actually really love a good ambiguous ending, but because, to my mind, ambiguity works best in a story when it leaves you sitting with one focused question, where either answer makes you think. I think that's when ambiguity works really, really well. And the problem for me with that episode was that its ambiguity wasn't very clear in what it wanted us to wrestle with as the audience. The core dilemma of the entire episode was really, really strong. It was asking this question of, should a man like Ra, who never faced justice for his war crimes, be held accountable Or is it more important that he is doing good by being allowed to live and working to broker peace, even if it means letting him off the hook for accountability for his crimes? And on top of that, it kind of also tangentially asked, is Mbenga himself somewhat a reflection of Ra? Because Mbenga himself was also responsible for enacting arguably war crimes. And should he face accountability for the violence that he enacted against some Klingons? So it was a very complicated, interesting ethical question there. But the ending kind of muddles all that by layering on three conflicting possibilities and readings of what actually happens. We have one possibility, Ra killed himself out of guilt. 2, Ra attacked Mbenga and Mbenga killed Ra in self-defense. Or 3, Mbenga killed Ra in cold blood. These three different options tell radically different stories, but instead of deepening that central question, it kind of dilutes it. Because rather than focusing on justice versus peace, the ending kind of spirals out because it's asking too many half-assed questions. I mean, we have to ask, was Ra avoiding accountability, or was he genuinely trying to atone in a flawed but sincere way? Or was he actually doing the right thing for the greater good? And then on top of that, did Mbenga actually kill him? And if he did kill him, was it justice or vengeance, self-defense, or something in between? And on top of that, it asks us, okay, if Mbenga did kill him for any of those reasons, do we think it was right? Like, there's a lot of questions left open at the end there, and the problem is the episode doesn't choose which any of these it wants us to focus on. Again, all good, complicated questions, but they were all stacked on top of each other rather than being really interwoven. So instead of inviting us to sit with one hard question, it threw a handful at the wall. And what could have been a sharp exploration of war crimes, guilt, and accountability ended up being muddled and indecisive by asking too many questions and offering too many interpretations, in my opinion. And so now, this follow-up episode that we're getting here confirms, in fact, that Mbenga did kill Ra deliberately out of a sense of justice. And that clarification retroactively recenters the moral question of the earlier episode. Was it right for Mbenga to kill Ra? But then it also flattens the ambiguity of that ending into something much flatter. It makes the original ending of that episode feel unnecessarily convoluted on a rewatch now that we've been given this actual specific answer to those questions, since the actual thematic resolution doesn't really arrive now until this episode. And even here, it doesn't really fully land within this episode because the episode already has too much else going on. We have zombies, Battel, the Gorn, Ortagus. It's just too busy to make space for the emotional weight that this specific storyline needs. So the Ra arc ends up being buried here in this episode amongst everything else. And worse still, it reframes the question a little bit of the original episode. The storyline, if we track from the original episode to here, no longer asks whether Ra deserved to die. It kind of assumes that he did in a way. Maybe you disagree with me, but no one in this episode here pushes back against the idea that Ra deserved to die or not. Not even Pike, who mostly shrugs at the end of the episode and says, well, I wish you had told me.
I understand why you didn't tell me certain things. Just wish I'd known some of them sooner.
This could have been a moment here at the end of this episode where Pike and Mbenga talk, where Pike could have offered a deeper counterpoint, even if we end up not resolving it. But it never really comes. Instead, Pike sort of avoids having to vocalize any real stance at all.
I don't have any report to file.
But if you did, hypothetically, what would it say?
That I had a knife to my throat and you told a story to save my life. That's what happened, wouldn't you agree?
Like, I really do wish Pike had at least vocalized a differing perspective in Mbenga, even if we still ended in the same place of, well, there's no report to file, so we'll just have to let it go. Like, compare Pike's nonchalance here with Sisko's much more avid criticism of Worf in this Deep Space Nine episode, in this scene that I'll show.
And it did not matter what Starfleet thought or what the consequences were. She was my wife, and I could not leave her.
As your captain, it is my duty to inform you that you made the wrong choice. As a man who had a wife. If Jennifer had been lying in that clearing, I wouldn't have left her either.
The end of that episode in Deep Space Nine doesn't answer whether or not Worf was right or not. It lets us see two differing points of view, one that valued the larger, needs of Starfleet in the fight for the Dominion War over Worf's personal desire to save his spouse. Both are legitimate, but we do get two opposing point of views. And I wish we had gotten something similar here with Pike and M'Benga. And as a result, this episode just kind of narrows to a much blander question of, is M'Benga a good person or not? Which I think is kind of too simple a question. It reduces a really thorny moral dilemma about accountability, justice, and the potential for peace into a personal question of morality. And again, I'm not saying the show needs to give us a clear answer on any of it. That's the strength of ambiguity, when it invites the audience to sit with contradiction. But this is simplifying an already unfocused episode from season 2 into something smaller. Are you good or bad or somewhere in between? And I think asking questions of good or bad when it comes to this context is kind of missing the point. I think it's much more ethically thorny, I guess is the best, or philosophically thorny, I guess is the best way to put it. And so that's kind of where I come down on the M'Benga storyline. I honestly just feel like they're going back to try to retroactively fix up an episode that I think a lot of people had criticisms of, but by only sort of including it within a much larger episode, doing other things. And so I think it just kind of is not really, it kind of just ends up simplifying things rather than fixing anything, really. So at the end of this episode, while there are definitively things I do like about this one, I think ultimately it's trying to do way too much. And even the things that it does do well, or at least focuses on, I'm pretty mixed about. There are some moments that work, like Pike and Battel's final scene, but overall this episode feels kind of scattered and doesn't make the full episode feel like a satisfying thing unto itself. This really just feels engineered to move plot beats forward for Pike and Ortagus, as well as squeeze in a response to some of the criticisms around the M'Benga storyline from last season. And then, throw in some zombies on top of it to make it feel like it's, all fitting together as one cohesive narrative. And unfortunately, it really just doesn't. For a show that markets itself as episodic and self-contained with light serialization on top, this episode feels really unfocused and overstuffed. So sadly, I'm walking away from this episode with mixed feelings. But that said, next week's episode is the much discussed murder mystery episode that is going to be directed by none other than Riker himself, Jonathan Frakes. So I am genuinely excited for that one. It looks like it'll have a lot tighter focus and steer away from a lot of the stuff that hasn't been really working for me this season. So fingers crossed. I really want to love this show and this season. But what do you think? Let me know down in the comments below. But until then, I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper.